Perfect. Okay, so now you should be able to see what you want to see, and we can see just the slide. So you're good to go.
Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Okay, perfect. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for continuing on with our second plenary session of this afternoon. I'm excited to announce our next plenary speaker, Dr. Erica Marsh. Dr. Marsh is the professor and chief of the Division of Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility at the University of Michigan School of Medicine. Dr. Marsh is also the director of community engagement for the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, and also the founder and director of the Onward Women's Health and Reproductive Disparities Collaborative. Dr. Marsh is here to speak with us this afternoon on preparing the next generation, critical race theory, anti-racism, and the future of medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marsh.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that very kind introduction. And I want to say thank you also to the organizing committee for the invitation, particularly Dr. Helen Morgan. It's particularly meaningful to be with you all today, albeit virtually, as a plenary speaker, because I'm at an institution with an incredible team of committed Ob-Gyn medical educators that I'm privileged to work with and learn from myself every day at the University of Michigan, including Dr. Morgan, of course, Dr. Dee Finner and Dr. Maya Hamoud, who've served as past APGO presidents, but is also Dr. Angela Liang, Sam Kipner, Dave Marzano, Anita Malone, and the list goes on. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Just want to start by sharing some disclosures here, but also want to share that, you know, this talk is not necessarily a light and sunshiny talk. It's not. It doesn't have a goal of being difficult, but some of the things we're going to talk about are going to be difficult to hear, or may be difficult to hear. And I also want to share that this talk is via the lens of the African American experience, but by no means unique to it or intended to be limited by it. So our objectives today are to really introduce the basic tenets of critical race theory. We're not going to be able to do a deep dive, but we will hopefully end the conversation with a better understanding of what are the basic pieces of it, what's all the ruckus about, and be motivated to learn more yourselves. We want to review some aspects of American history that contribute to the development of critical race theory. And then we want to try to spend a few minutes trying to understand what's the intersection between CRT, or critical race theory, and medicine, and particularly medical education, and what can you do or should you be doing as leading medical educators to enforce certain aspects of or teach certain aspects of critical race theory. So it's been an interesting journey for all of us, you know, between COVID and the social unrest and kind of revelation in this country. The last couple of years have been incredibly challenging for all of us, for our learners. And I first started giving a version of this talk last year in the fall. And I gave the first version, if you will, at the AGOS meeting, where I asked, how did we get here? You know, how did we get to Breonna Taylor, a young, unarmed EMT, getting shot in her own home by the police? And not how did we get there, but how did we get here and here and here as a nation? But now I find myself asking a different set of questions, which is, how did we get here? You know, how do we get to a place where parents, teachers, school boards, communities are screaming at one another, are threatening one another, are pulling funding, are taking jobs, and are talking about the indoctrination of their children by critical race theory, a theory that most people had never heard of a couple of years ago. So, and beyond that, how do we get to a place when you do stand up, when you do try to teach, whether it's critical race theory or simply talk about racism, where your job is at risk. People are getting fired over talking about racism in some cases and the existence of it, as well as talking about critical evaluation of our history. So, and last but not least, I would say, how do we get to a place where we had an executive order like this? Now, as most of us know, one of President Trump's last executive orders was Executive Order 13950, was issued in September of his final year and entitled an executive order on combating race and sexual stereotyping. You know, it's a fascinating read, and it begins, you know, as most executive orders do, by the authority vested in me as president and by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, but goes on to talk about, you know, he's issuing this executive order in order to promote economy and efficiency in federal contracting, to promote unity in the federal workforce, and to combat offensive and anti-American race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating, and is hereby ordered. And, you know, obviously we don't have time to go through this, but is essentially discusses inclusion of diversity related training, or any training regarding racism being a part of the history of the country, as being designed to divide us and to prevent us from uniting as one people in pursuit of one common destiny for our great country. And one has to ask the question then, you know, what people is he talking about and who benefits in that common destiny? Now, you know, thankfully, one of the first executive orders that was issued by our current president, President Biden, was to reverse that order. And it was entitled an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. But what is, you know, what is this little known theory that has initiated executive orders, that has created tension, you know, best case scenario and worst case scenario, violence in local communities over education of our children? Critical race theory is the theory. It was initially published in the 1970s, and it was an evolution of work that was done by abolitionist Frederick Douglass, Sir John Truth, and scholar W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the NAACP. And it was born as an analysis of the effectiveness of legislation and policy that was intended to remove barriers to social, political, and economic mobility of marginalized groups. And specifically, it was a review of all of the acts that were passed during at the end of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then scholars took a step back in the 1970s and asked themselves, like, wait, what really has changed? The founders, if you will, of critical race theory include Professor Derek Bell, the late Professor Derek Bell, who unfortunately we lost last year, who again developed CRT as an explanation of what he was seeing or wasn't seeing, quite frankly, coming out of the civil rights bill, the housing bill, the voting bill, as well as Kimberly Crenshaw, who really brought to bear a concept of intersectionality, which we'll talk about shortly. Richard Delgado, Alan Friedman, I should put his name on as well, were that part of that core group of scholars, of law professors, legal professors that kind of initiated critical race theory. What are the tenets of critical race theory? Probably the most heated one is the permanence of racism, but also includes counter storytelling, whiteness as property, interest convergence, a critique of liberalism, and intersectionality. And what does all that mean? Again, there are graduate level courses on critical race theory, so we're not going to be able to do a very deep dive, but want you to understand kind of structurally what initiated critical race theory, what its pillars are, our tenets are, and to briefly discuss in lay-ish terms what they mean. Critical race theory first asserts that racism is a persistent component of our legal, social, political fabric in the U.S. It's not an other; it is part of who we are and part of our structures. In particular, that's really what critical race theory asserts, that racism is part of the legal, social, political structures in the United States. Critical race theory also challenges the traditional historical narrative of America by ensuring that perspectives and experiences of marginalized groups are included in how we talk about history, and specifically how we talk about race. It examines the intersectionality of race and other identities. Initially, again, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw focused on the race of the intersectionality of race and gender. That has been expanded now to looking at race and intersectionality of race and gender identity, race and sexual orientation, race and faith, in a number in race and ability or disability status, and to see how all of those other identities intersect to create a new set of challenges, if you will. And then lastly, it takes exception to race negating terminology. And what does that mean? It argues that statements like, oh, I'm colorblind or I'm race neutral, is really to deny a significant part of the existence of people of color, and to deny the historical realities of our country. It denies, if you will, the consequence of race, and makes, it thus kind of makes discussions of meritocracy quite challenging. It gives place to it calls out really the fallacy of color blindness in denying that there's a historical consequence of being Black or being Asian or being Hispanic, or being part of an indigenous population or Native American. And take, for example, the grandfather clause or the literacy clause, who on their face didn't mention the word race. On their face were race neutral policies, but had a very absolute consequence in basically preventing Blacks from voting. If you create a law that says if your grandfather voted in 1960, then you can vote today, then there are not a whole lot of Black Americans who would have been able to vote. If you selectively apply a literacy test to certain people who come to register to vote, even though you don't mention the name race, race absolutely plays a role. And I feel like I want to share just the first couple of lines of a poem by Pat Parker, who was a feminist poet who died. I think Pat Parker died in the 80s, but she wrote this poem that is called "For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend." Pat Parker is African-American woman. And she says, the first thing you need to do is forget that I'm Black. Second, you must never forget that I'm Black. And I think that speaks to the tension of opposites that we are dealing with, and that critical race theory tries to kind of address. Yes, in an ideal world, color blindness, color neutrality, race neutrality would be wonderful concepts, but we're not living in an ideal world. So you can never not see that part of me that is shaped so vividly by my race. So let's talk a little bit about what critical race theory is not. It's not part of K through 12 curriculum, okay? I know that there's some really advanced elementary schools and middle schools and high schools and across the country that are really being proactive about pushing curricula, but critical race theory isn't being taught in kindergarten, okay? And it's not really an undergrad topic until very recently. It is a graduate level topic. It's also not an indoctrination of any type. That's not the goal. It is no more an indoctrination than what we're being taught right now. Okay, so it is not a condemnation of any group or individual. It's certainly not patriotic. One could argue that it is for love of country that critical race theory was developed. It's not about promoting hatred, and it's not Marxist or communist. It is, I think, critical race theory is first and foremost, it's a theory, okay? It's, when you look at the origins of the word theory, the theoria, looking at, viewing, beholding, and then the next iteration of the origins, which, are analyzing, assessing, contemplating. There are a lot of theories out there that we teach. Of course, the theory of evolution. There's climate change theory. There's global warming theory. There's, passions around those things as well. For our educators, there's multiple intelligence theory. There's a critical pedagogy theory, constructivist theory. For our economists, there's macro and microeconomic theory. I haven't seen anybody rioting over macroeconomic theory, though. And one has to take a step back and say, what is it about critical race theory that is so challenging, that is so eruptive, that incites such passion? And it's really race. And it takes us, I think it's a very clear example of our discomfort in this country, of our continued discomfort of talking about race, its place in its history, and the impact that race and racism continues to have. James Baldwin, the noted author, wrote a piece in 1965. So the context and the timing are important. Where he says they, and he's referring to Americans, and he's specifically, to be fair, referring to white Americans in this piece. They are dimly or vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie. They do not know how to release themselves from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. I think that's true of all of us. We have all been fed a lie. We've all been fed an incomplete history. We know this at some level, and now we are paying the price for that and are struggling to try to figure out, how do we make sense of this? And I all get it. We all want to feel a sense of pride in our history, and we do. We're all proud to be Americans most days, but that can't come at the cost of the lessons that we gain from it. And one of those main goals of teaching history is to make sure we learn from it, to make sure we don't repeat the parts of it that cause us shame or pain or harm, to make sure we never replicate that part of ourselves that is humane or cruel or heartless. That objective is much more important than the transient discomfort that simply talking about it in a classroom or on rounds or in a lecture may cause. We have to revisit it so that we don't replicate it. So, what does that history look like? Where did that history begin? 3 years ago, so 2019 marked the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Africans to the Jamestown colony in Virginia. It was the very beginnings of what was to become the United States at the time. And the enslavement and trade of human beings from slave castles of West Africa. This is a picture of one that I took when I was in Cape Coast and in the west coast of Ghana, is shown here. Enslaved Africans were packed like cargo and bought via the Middle Passage, and that's referring to the oceanic voyage between West Africa in most cases to British colonies in North America, and coupled with eventual genocide of indigenous people, Native Americans. That's the consequence of what was at the time, a white supremacist ideology and the very well contemplated benefits of a free labor force. So, what did that yield? People became property. They were stripped of their languages, their identity, their families, and their cultural ties. And enslaved Africans, the ones that actually survived the voyage, because many died during the Middle Passage, were brutalized and treated as little more than livestock. These were people who were forced to reorient themselves in a place they had chosen not to live, and they were treated under barbaric conditions for generations. So, as we transition from being colonies to a country, our future leaders penned some of the most elegant and profound writings on freedom in the writing of the Declaration of Independence to King George. These are the same writings that were quoted, in fact, in President Trump's executive order. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, however beautifully written, that rhetoric of liberty and freedom that served as a basis of our founding, we all agree on that, was transformational to some and meaningless to others, namely women, indigenous peoples, and certainly enslaved Africans. So almost a century later, Abraham Lincoln is elected as president. He's held up as the great emancipator, but was he? Was he the original anti-racist? This is a quote from Lincoln. "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races." So no, he wasn't I don't think we can say he was an anti-racist. Was he at least anti-slavery? This is a world of compensations, and he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. So maybe we can say he's anti-slavery, maybe. But fundamentally, Lincoln was pro-union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do also that. And so freeing some and leaving others alone is part of what we saw as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, where in some states slavery was still allowed, in some states it was not. And then it was the 13th Amendment that freed all the slaves. Frederick Douglass and the Republican Party advocated strongly that ending slavery in the Union was as important as preserving it. And so for Union, emancipation provided really a strategic military and moral position on which he could stand. But this wasn't, although we all appreciate the outcome at some level. This wasn't because of any particularly high moral standing on Lincoln's part. So then we got the Civil War, 750,000 casualties, a president assassinated, and a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, again, the 13th Amendment, finally changed the United States into a nation where slavery no longer exists. And after 2.5 centuries of enslavement, Africans are finally African Americans, but we can't legislate people's hearts. We've learned that century after century, nor can you legislate morality. And so they faced resistance from the newly formed KKK that was founded in December of 1965 to suppress and victimize the newly freed. Local and state laws known as Black codes are enacted in the South in response to the 13th Amendment and to restrict African American social and economic mobility. Immediately after the Civil War, we have this beam of light called Reconstruction. That period, that 10-year period between 1867 and 1877, and during this window, African Americans get a brief taste of participating in the American experiment on their own terms, for the first time. Through public education, through ownership of property, through the right to vote, through the initiation and establishment of historically Black colleges and universities. The 14th Amendment is ratified in 1868, promising equal protection under the law for all citizens. And the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870, granting Black men the right to vote. Again, historically Black colleges like the one shown here and universities are founded and really lay the groundwork for a Black professional class for the first time. And the US House and Senate see their first Black members, but it doesn't last. So next, we see compromise and reconciliation between the Northern and Southern whites after the election of 1876, that was the election of Hayes. And that unleashes really a backlash against African Americans that reverses nearly all of the gains that were made during the Reconstruction years. Black codes that were enacted during the Civil War were replaced following the Civil War, were replaced with widespread legislation designed to reinsert and embolden white dominance in the South. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's right to segregate public spaces as Constitution 8-1. And Plessy v. Ferguson cements separate but equal as law of the land, and the Jim Crow era is born. Now, the sole dissenting justice in that 8-1 vote was Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he wrote this, I think, very eloquently in his dissenting opinion. If evils will result from the commingling of the two races upon public highways established for the benefit of all, they will infinitely be less than those that will surely come from state legislation regulating the enjoyment of civil rights upon the basis of race. We boast of the freedom enjoyed by our people above all other peoples, but it is difficult to reconcile that boast with the state of law, which practically puts the brand of servitude and degradation among a large class of our fellow citizens, our equals before the law. The thin disguise of equal accommodations for passengers and railroad coaches will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done. So where next? In 1909, the NAACP was founded by an interracial group that included Ida B. Wells, Mary Ovington, Henry Moskowitz, and W.B. Du Bois. And 11 years later, in 1920, women, that is white women, were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The progressive area was not so progressive for everyone. Membership in the Ku Klux Klan explodes, due in no small part to the release of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, in which secession, the Civil War, and the birth of the Ku Klux Klan are reimagined and glorified. Now, lynching continues to be employed as a terror tactic to enforce Black subjugation. This is what dehumanization looks like. And this is what it does to both the oppressed and the oppressor. Black bodies hanging from trees while celebratory crowds are out for the evening, their faces reflecting no shock, no remorse, no shame. Now, these bodies, like thousands of others, served as an inspiration for Billie Holiday's classic Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. The song was written in 1937 by Ob-Gyn, who was a teacher in New York under his pseudonym, Lewis Allen. And when asked why he wrote it, he stated, because I hated lynching, I hated injustice, and I hated the people that perpetrated it. Then we jump forward to the modern movement. Here we have a generation of leaders and numbers not previously seen amongst the African-American community, including Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, who are all rise to demand change. Marches, boycotts, sit-ins, lawsuits, they all force America to reckon with its past and drive the nation closer to racial equality, or that's the goal anyway. The fight to desegregate public schools achieves a major victory with the Brown v. Board of Education suit in 1954, and the legal team for that is shown here with, of course, Thurgood Marshall in the center, surrounded by Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, and the full legal team that argued that case. Now, also happening at that time, from the 1920s really through the 1980s, and some would argue it may still be going on, is the Mississippi appendectomy phenomenon, or atrocity, we should call it what it is, was being perpetrated on largely women of color and poor women, and as part of states' efforts to control who should and should not reproduce, and to allow them to train their learners on how to do hysterectomies, frankly. It was mostly seen, or disproportionately seen, in the southern states, and was coined by civil rights advocate Fannie Lou Hamer. After going in for surgery, she thought, to remove a tumor and waking up without a uterus. In Killing the Black Body, Dorothy Robert writes about that sterilization and the growth of that movement, really between 1970s even through the 80s, and it was so common that it was again named the Mississippi appendectomy. So during that window, we saw the spark within the African-American community that pulled folks in, really engaged them. And that spark was not the legal spark that Brown v. Board of Education provided, but for everyday Black America, it was the murder of Emmett Till, shown here. Now, in 1955, a year after the Brown v. Board of decision, Carolyn Bryant, also shown here, accused 14-year-old Till of flirting with her in her store in Money, Mississippi. Emmett had come down for the summer to visit his grandfather and cousins, and Bryant's allegation led to Till being kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. Now, his body was only released on the condition that it would not be viewed publicly, only released to his mom, but his mother, Mamie Till, demanded an open casket so that the world could see what the South had done to her son. Emmett's grandfather, Moses Wright, identified Bryant's husband in open court with his famous quote, "thar he." And despite this, the jury deliberated about an hour, a little over an hour, long enough to have lunch, one of the jurors later shared. And Bryant's husband and his accomplice and brother-in-law were acquitted by the crime bar all-white, all-male jury. The following year, knowing that they couldn't be retried for the crime, they provided an in-depth interview that was published nationally, acknowledging that they had committed the murder, providing details. And Carolyn Bryant, later in life, in her 70s, later recanted her entire story. Now, the Black community had endured and was, quite frankly, used to lynchings in its community, and had endured probably about 4,000 lynchings at that time. But the senseless killing of an innocent 14-year-old boy really galvanized the community in a way that it had not been galvanized before. This mobilization was evident later that year when Rosa Parks, in an act of planned defiance, it wasn't a random act, it was an act of planned defiance, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This was an act that opened the door to the Montgomery bus boycott and facilitated the meteoric rise of a little known at that time 26-year-old pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. to national and international prominence. Now, finally, in the 1960s, we see progress, or what we think is progress. In 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. In February 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while giving a speech at the Audubon Hotel in New York. And later that year, in August, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made illegal many of the practices in the South that were established to prevent Blacks from voting. So while Blacks, or at least Black men, had been given the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment, it was almost 100 years later that right was federally protected. On April 4th, 1968, the day after he had given his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot in the face and killed at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. And later that month, the Fair Housing Act was signed by Johnson, preventing housing discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. So it was moving out of all of this incredible legislation that for sure, was felt to get us, if not at equality, very close to it, that the critical race theory was born. And it was born based on the observation, largely by Derek Bell and others, that appeared, that nothing was really changing. And I think that's encapsulated beautifully in this quote from Bell. It appears that my worst fears have been realized. We have made progress in everything, and yet nothing has changed. Looking at rates of desegregation, wealth gaps, levels of educational attainment, all the things that the civil rights movement was supposed to have addressed and its subsequent legislation was supposed to have addressed, the progress was either slow, very slow, or non-existent. Now, it was, again, out of this context that the critical race theory was born, to say, how is that possible? How is it possible with all this progress that we've made that nothing has changed? And that's where the idea that racism is embedded in our very systems and manifest itself, even when we're trying to do the right thing. It manifests itself in a way that is either more beneficial to whites in this country and or not beneficial at all to African Americans. And so, we end up with lenses like this. You got me the wrong history book. This one not only has slavery in it, but it says that it was bad. Whether you knew this history that I've shared or not, it's really the engine that's driven us to this point. It's the blueprint for how we got to where we are and why we have to have some conversations that we haven't really had, conversations that are hard on all fronts for all of us. We are not going to understand how to be an anti-racist until we understand the racism that we're fighting and we're acknowledging it. And we have to really let go that our past is our present is untouched by the ripples of these events, because it is not only touched, it's quite frankly in their embrace. And that's why it's important for us to understand. What does that mean for critical race theory and medicine? Now, critical race theory has long been, it was born as a review of law and legal systems. It expanded very quickly to include education. It's a relatively new lens in the setting of medicine. And again, as we are learning more about, as the broader country is learning about critical race theory, we're seeing we're seeing it more in our literature. We're seeing it in our media. We're seeing it globally as well as a possible mechanism for helping us address health equity in particular. And how is that relevant? Well, we know that there's issues of health disparities that align with race. And, just a few examples here. When we think about endometriosis, Joseph Miggs proposed that endometriosis, years ago was associated with lifestyle, occurred more amongst private patients than hospital ward patients. And ultimately endometriosis became, and I would argue is still associated with the white middle class women. And, in a review in 1956, endometriosis was described as a disease of white women in the higher income brackets. Now, Donald Chapman published a case review in APGO that showed that endometriosis was actually in 21% of folks that were taken to the OR and previously thought to have PID. He largely saw African-American women in the South Side of Chicago at Michael Reese Hospital. But that perception continued to be present. Soni Singh published data that shows that we continue to underdiagnose endometriosis in African-American women. And it's not just endometriosis. We as a field saw may have made changes in addressing equity and looking at the impact of race and how we include it, how we should not include it in certain cases when it came to the VBAC calculator. And we also saw that it extends well beyond that in other clinical algorithms ranging from renal function to breast cancer risk to need for home-based health services. And of course, the elephant in our room, which is maternal mortality, and how is that disparity, injustice still happening, and how is it getting worse and not better? So what does that mean for medical education? I don't think the answer is to start teaching, start necessarily including permanence of racism, whiteness of property, interest conversion, counter storytelling, those tenets of critical race theory and medical education. But I do think that we can boil those things down to language that I've talked about and previously that is very relevant to us all as human beings, and that overlaps in to a large extent with the tenets of critical race theory, and that's humility, ownership, courage, conviction, and hope. So why humility? Humility requires really for us to have a willingness to understand the truth about the origins of our country, a willingness to look in the mirror and understand our own biases, our own challenges, to understand that our textbook version of our country's greatness includes the good, but doesn't include the bad and the ugly in the way that it needs to allow us to have an honest understanding of our history. We have to have that humility with our patients to understand that our patients know things about themselves that we don't, despite our training. And we have to have the humility to realize there are things that we need to learn that are gonna make us better doctors in terms of better understanding the history. So, it's great to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, but I would encourage you to start with Ibram Kendi's first or earlier book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. You know, looking at Slavery by Another Name, Before the Mayflower Classic by Lerone Benefit, The Half Has Never Been Told, of course, Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, The Condemnation of Blackness, From Slavery to Freedom, which is a classic by John Hope Franklin, another Dorothy Roberts text, The Fatal Invention, and then Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid. Because you can call this indoctrination if you want to, but if you do, we also have to call this indoctrination and understand that the indoctrination that we've gotten for the past 400 years. In our textbooks, you know, if we want to talk about K through 12 education, let's talk about that and look at the textbooks and what, you know, what's being described as Africans immigrating to the United States. And specifically the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agriculture plantations. Now, you know, this is a very classic example of race negating literature. Technically, that sentence is correct. Technically, that sentence is true, but it's not the whole truth, right? And it's not nothing but the truth. So, you know, indoctrination takes a lot of forms, and this has been our indoctrination up until this point, and we need to push beyond that. Ownership. Now, of course, not of other people, but of ourselves, of our legacy, of our history. Because this is not what we're worried about, right? We can see this coming a mile away. We know that this individual embraces and owns his white supremacy. But this is more worrisome. And you may not recognize her. You may recognize her better in this photo. You know, this is what's more dangerous. This is the person who sees herself as a good person, is on many accounts a good person, but in a moment of stress or pressure, understands that her whiteness allows her to weaponize the police against a Black man. And she acts on that and shares that she's going to act on that. And the bottom line is there's no place of protection from racism. There's no rank, there's no white coat, there's no grant I can get, there's no paper I can publish that protects me or people of color from racism. So we have to make sure we are seeing it where it is. And it's easy to look away from the Amy Coopers in our world, and they are everywhere. But when you look away from that, you also look away from racism, and then you end up looking away from a large population of your learners, of your colleagues, of your friends, of your neighbors. We have to see it all. We have to see it in all of its ugliness. We can't turn away. We have to own it. Courage. Incredibly important. I think the thing that's probably most important, because we're in a scary place right now in America. We're in a place where sharing your opinion or presenting a theory presents a threat, but also speaking the truth is a threat. And we have to decide that truth is more important than fear. I love this quote by Ambrose Redmoon: courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. Justice has to be more important than fear. Integrity has to be more important than fear. Equity, equality have to be more important than fear. You know, I have a number of people, have had a number of mentors and educators in my life who haven't looked like me, who haven't walked in my shoes, but who have had really tough tough conversations, and who've been willing to have those conversations about what it's been like to walk in my shoes, and worked hard to understand what that felt like, and to make sure that the workspace that I and others and all of us are in is one that provides equitable learning and opportunities to thrive. Next is conviction. You know, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. We have to make our learners aware that this isn't a favor that any of us are doing for one another, that this is necessary for all of our liberations. Our futures are inextricably bound. When we acknowledge our history and help one another, we liberate ourselves, all of us, from the shackles of that very history. And lastly, hope. Some ways the hardest of these. I know mine has certainly been challenged over the last couple of years, but I try to remain hopeful. And when I feel like I'm faltering, I, for one, rely on something higher than myself. That's different for all of us, but I love this quote by the Apostle Paul: "We are distressed on every side, troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, cast down, but not destroyed." You know, whatever lens we view it through, name or theory we choose to call it, we can't allow racism to destroy us, but it could if we don't act. We have to have the courage to really imagine a place we've never been before. We have to acknowledge our collective past, all of it, not just the good parts, all of it with humility. We have to be courageous in our pursuit of equity, and we have to own our behavior and our experiences and remain hopeful that we're going to see our best days ahead. The future of our learners depends on it. Our institutions, our patients, our communities, our families, and our country depend on it. With that, I'm going to close with a thank you to the three people, my parents and my brother, who really made sure that I knew all of my history. I learned it growing up, and made sure that in the space of that history, despite it, that we lead with love, love, love. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Marsh. That was a really powerful and important plenary session. There was a lot of comments towards the end of your talk. I think during most of the delivery of your talk, people were taking it all in, and it was very powerful for me and for our audience. So thank you so much. There's a question here from Dr. Claire, who asked, comments first. This was an excellent historical perspective. Can you please speak to the post-Obama era and continued resurgence of white supremacy? Thank you.
You know, I think what the election of President Obama showed us was the danger of suppressing discussions about race. And I think there was a celebratory period of feeling like, oh, we're post-racial now, we have an African-American president. But the reality was, there were segments of the population that did and continue to clearly feel that equity is not a goal, let alone equality. And again, we have to decide how to have conversations with people that we disagree with, and move from a place of really righteous indignation to, can you help me understand your perspective? Or even if I don't agree with it, can we have to take that time, because we're in a place now where we're divided by, red or blue, Fox or CNN, Democrat or Republican, and we have to move beyond that, because standing across from one another and pointing a finger has not gotten us far at all. And so that's where the hard work, that's where the courage comes in. that's where leading with love has to come in. And I think we have to stop just having conversations with people who agree with us, which is easy to do and makes us feel safe and makes us feel like the world agrees with us, and start having conversations with people who don't agree with us, who don't believe as we do, and trying to say, okay, how can we find a common space? There are people who out there who just hate, and may not be willing to come to the table. But I think there are a lot of people who just may not understand, or may have learned differently than we did, or may have learned incorrectly, and there's a lot of or may have feel we learned incorrectly. And so I think there's a lot of room for us to start building bridges, not just with people who agree with us, but people who don't agree with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I do want to be cognizant of time, because our workshops, or the Innovation Festival is starting at 1/4 after. So thank you again, Dr. Marsh. I did want to quickly mention a few important things to all of the attendees out there. This is the last time we'll be meeting collectively for today. I do want to let you know that you'll be receiving an email shortly after the conference ends today, probably about 3 or 4 o'clock. It's an evaluation survey. Please fill it out. We do use it to guide future programming through APGO. I do also want to let you know that you can claim your CME credits. Go to the homepage on Whova, and you can find information there on how to collect and claim your CME. So we will take a break. We're going to reconvene at 3:15 for the Innovation Festival, and then we will reconvene again on Friday, January 21st, for the 3rd day of our virtual APGO FDS. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Marsh, for your plenary talk.
Thank you, Dr.